Russian President Vladimir Putin is ready to end the war in Ukraine. That's the message four unnamed Russian sources delivered to Reuters on May 24, 2024. According to those sources, Putin is open to negotiating a ceasefire with Ukraine that would see the current battlefield lines essentially become a new border between the countries. Russia would control everything on its side of the front lines, including the Ukrainian territory it's already taken, while Ukraine would get to keep what they've managed to defend. Three of Reuters' sources have even said that Putin is frustrated at the lack of peace talks. He believes the West is attempting to prevent a ceasefire from being negotiated, presumably to serve its own ends, while Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelenskyy has also repeatedly said that he will not hold peace talks with Putin. All of this leads us to an obvious question. Why? Why is Putin apparently so ready to open ceasefire talks now after he's spent over 2 years bombarding Ukraine? Before we dig into that question, it's important to point out that Reuters sources believe that a ceasefire is far from the only option Putin is floating. As one of them puts it, Putin can fight for as long as it takes, but Putin is also ready for a ceasefire to freeze the war. Putin himself has suggested the same thing. When quizzed about the Reuters reports while in Belarus, Putin said, "Let them resume," in regards to the peace talks, but there was a caveat. He also added that any negotiation should be based on the realities on the ground and can't proceed on the basis of what one side wants. Those realities on the ground may bring us to the first reason why Putin is ready to talk. He thinks he's taken enough territory. We can look to the BBC for insight into how significant those gains have been. In a May 2024 report, it released a series of maps to show how much Ukrainian territory Russia either controls outright or at least partially controls. It points out that Russian forces have managed to cross the international border separating Belgorod and Kharkiv, Ukraine's second-largest city, to make what some analysts call tactically significant advances. The Institute for the Study of War, or ISW, says that Russia has managed to take several northern areas around the city of Vovchansk, which includes the town's hospital, as well as taking territory inside Staritsya. Vovchansk hasn't been taken yet, but if Russia were to secure it in a ceasefire agreement, it would bring the border between Russia and Ukraine down to 45 miles away from Kharkiv, not enough to take Ukraine's second city, but close enough to make that city an obvious target should Russia decide to relaunch the war at a later date. Still, even here we see where disputes would likely arise if ceasefire talks were opened. While Russia would claim these territorial wins, Ukraine would claim that it's been stabilizing the situation around Kharkiv. Russia's 30,000 troops in the region are supposedly conducting fewer operations, though Putin could claim that's simply because they're preparing a larger operation that would see them breach the city. A point of contention arises that could stall the talks. More substantial is the territory Russia currently controls in Ukraine's east. Putin now controls much of the Donbas region, which includes several tactically significant positions. He holds Luhansk, Donetsk, and Mariupol, as well as having recently taken the fortified town of Avdiivka. The latter territory is especially important as it could provide Russia with a route deeper into Ukraine, as well as give it a defensive position it can use to prevent Ukrainian troops from advancing into Donetsk. To the southwest of Donbas, Russia also holds Melitopol. Then there's Bakhmut. On May 22, 2024, Russian media outlets began reporting that Moscow had captured Bakhmut. Comparisons to Russia's capture of Berlin during World War II were made, signifying how important this victory appeared to be in Moscow. Russian media was also quick to restore the city's former Soviet name of Artyomovsk, with one Russian anchor saying the myth that Artyomovsk is an unassailable fortress has been crushed. For the record, Ukraine claims that the fighting in the city isn't over. But if Russia has captured Bakhmut, it's as important a victory as taking Avdiivka. The city represents another position Russia can fortify, as well as another potential route deeper into Ukraine. The message Putin would want to send in any ceasefire negotiations becomes clearer. Russia is slowly taking Ukrainian territory. Surrender that territory now, delivering it fully to Russian control, and Ukraine will be able to prevent further advances. Any territory gained in the country's north would be a bonus for Moscow, though not essential when compared to keeping what it's gained in Ukraine's east. This would be a massive blow to Ukraine. According to the Washington Post, Russia now controls more Ukrainian territory than Ukraine managed to liberate during its big 2023 counteroffensive. This means that Ukraine will be negotiating from a worse position than it had last year. Worse yet for Ukraine, it appears to be struggling to hold several other positions on its eastern front. This was revealed in a May 2024 Reuters article, which quoted Alexander Kozachenko, a Ukrainian gun commander, talking about his unit's ammunition struggles. Earlier in the war, Kozachenko's M777 howitzer fired off 100 shells per day toward Russian positions. Now, it's a luxury if we can fire 30 shells. All of this adds up to a great reason for Putin to want to negotiate a ceasefire. Russia has taken a lot of Ukrainian territory, and he'd be able to negotiate from a position of power, knowing that it will take time for Ukraine to shore up its forces with the billions in aid pledged to it by several Western nations earlier in 2024. But there's also a problem for Putin. While he controls a lot of Ukrainian territory, he doesn't control any regions in their entirety. Even in Donbass, where Russia has made its most significant gains, any border drawn along the current battle lines would split that territory in two. That might not be acceptable to Putin. He might instead argue that Russia should control all of Donbass, a condition that Zelenskyy would almost certainly refuse. Still, it's easy to make the argument that claiming the territory Russia currently holds would be reason enough for Putin to want a ceasefire. But there are others, with one of the biggest being that Putin believes that ending the war now, claiming the territory Russia controls in the process, will be enough for him to claim he's achieved victory. That's according to two of Reuters' sources. They both say that Putin has the view that Russia's gains in the war so far are enough to sell a victory to the Russian people if the war were to end today. Sell is the key word there. After all, Putin began the war because he essentially believes there's no such thing as Ukraine. To his mind, it isn't an independent country, at least not anymore, and what we know as Ukraine is actually Russia. Putin made this claim in the years before the war, including in his essay on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians. Published on the Kremlin's website in July 2021, the essay asserts that Russians and Ukrainians are one people, a single whole. He also says this is an assertion he's made many times, as well as a belief that is unfaltering. The rest of the essay provides an extended history lesson, albeit one colored by Putin's personal viewpoints, to reinforce his argument. He also argues that Ukraine was never a separate nation, with the country instead having been dragged into a dangerous geopolitical game aimed at turning Ukraine into a barrier between Europe and Russia, a springboard against Russia. Here, Putin reveals how he sees Ukraine and, by extension, how he wants his people to view the country. It is Russian land co-opted by nefarious Western forces to weaken Russia, meaning Ukraine has never actually been an independent state. It's simply a puppet for those who would oppose Russia. Ending the war now would allow Putin to sell his people on the idea that the war made great territorial gains. He could claim that he has weakened the barrier between Russia and Europe, dealing a blow to the West, and likely NATO in particular, through that weakening. He could even leave his people with the impression that Russia could go back to destroy the barrier entirely, taking full control of Ukraine in the future. Stopping now would not mean conceding. Russia has gained territory, Putin could point out, which is nothing more than a victory in terms of his view that the territory was Russia's to begin with. Whether the Russian people would buy what Putin's selling is another question. But by making the pitch, Putin would reveal another one of the reasons why he's looking for a ceasefire. Russia is slowly losing its appetite for the war. In truth, there's always been a large element of Russian society that never wanted to go to war with Ukraine in the first place. That's demonstrated by a June 2023 BBC report, which points out that anywhere between several 100,000 and several million Russians have left the country since the beginning of the war. Many have fled to Georgia and Kazakhstan, with others making asylum claims in Western countries like France and Germany. The consensus, according to the BBC, is that those who are leaving either have ideological differences with the concept of war against Ukraine or are simply attempting to escape Russia so that they won't be drafted into the country's army. Putin is also having to deal with deserters. In April 2024, the Kyiv Independent reported that more than 18,000 troops that were part of Russia's southern military district had abandoned their posts. It also highlighted that around 12,000 of that 18,000 are part of the 8th Combined Arms Army, which the news outlet says is often deployed into hostilities in eastern Ukraine. Of those deserters, 10,000 were mobilized conscripts, essentially soldiers drafted into the war, while the other 2,000 were contracted soldiers. That doesn't paint a pretty picture for Putin on the morale front. However, it would also be easy to argue that reports in the Kyiv Independent could be Ukrainian propaganda, especially as these figures come directly from Ukraine's military intelligence agency. That could be the case were it not for the other sources reporting similar issues. For instance, Novoya Gazeta reports that Get Lost, an organization that helps prospective deserters escape from their armies, claims that the number of Russian deserters requesting its services increased tenfold in January 2024. It says 28 soldiers deserted the Russian army via Get Lost in January 2023. That number was up to 284 the following year, with 50% of those desertions being contracted soldiers, with another 30% being recently mobilized reservists. Putin has attempted to combat these desertions. Russia introduced a harsh 10-year prison sentence for deserters during the war in an effort to stop people from running away. It's gotten so bad that some Russian soldiers purposefully injure themselves to avoid military service. That's according to a former Russian officer named Ivan, who now lives in Kazakhstan. He claims that not only did he give his soldiers extended leave on several occasions while knowing that many would never return, but that Moscow's harsher punishments have only led to Russian soldiers taking more desperate measures to escape. Running from the front lines is very dangerous, he says. People are fully aware that there are criminal consequences, but that doesn't stop them. Some pretend they are one of the dead or injured. Some shoot themselves in the foot to get out to a hospital and then escape from there. It's no surprise that so many Russian soldiers are deserting. They're dying at an alarming rate in Ukraine. That's according to the UK Defense Journal, which says that British intelligence officials believe that more than 450,000 Russian soldiers have been killed or wounded since the war began. For context, Russia entered Ukraine with a fighting force of between 120,000 and 160,000, meaning it has experienced 50% more casualties than the number of troops it initially sent into the country. Those soldiers are also seeing enormous amounts of Russian equipment getting destroyed. Around 7,700 tanks have gone up in smoke, along with 10,000 armored vehicles. The Black Sea Fleet is at about 2/3 of its original strength thanks to Ukrainian attacks, and Russian artillery systems are being destroyed at a rate of around 800 per year. It all adds up to a war that's showing Russia's people that they're not able to easily defeat a much smaller nation. And this is creating a massive morale problem. That problem isn't being aided by the sheer amount of money Russia has spent on the war. Reuters reports that Russia has likely spent at least $211 billion on equipping and deploying its troops between February 2022 and February 2024. It's also lost around $10 billion to cancelled arms sales. All of this is set against a backdrop of increasing poverty in the country. That may come as a surprise to those who've read that Russia's poverty rate is falling. According to Statista, the fourth quarter of 2023 saw Russian poverty levels drop to 9.9 million people living below the poverty line, the lowest they've been for over 3 years. So how could there be a poverty problem in Russia, or at least a problem that's become worse since the Ukraine war began? The answer is that Russia has tweaked the way it measures poverty levels. That's according to a July 2023 article published by The Insider that says Russia previously measured its poverty levels based on food prices. It doesn't anymore. Instead, it measures poverty by assessing relative values in each of its regions, tweaking its formulas to include what it calls regional coefficients. For instance, the Tula and Tambov regions have a regional coefficient of 0.83, which is Russia's way of saying that it believes living expenses are lower than the national average, so the people there can afford to be paid less. What's the result of this tweak? According to The Insider, 2.3 million people who would have fallen below Russia's poverty line based on its previous method are no longer considered to be in poverty. This might create a situation in which those who are clearly still in poverty now see billions being spent on the military, while being told that their own living situations aren't as dire as they believe them to be. Putin will be taking notice of all of this. He recognizes that extending the war in Ukraine is risky from a popularity perspective. He may have recently won a presidential election with a landslide victory, even if the validity of the election can be disputed, but even he knows that he needs to bend to the will of his people to some degree. By being open to declaring a ceasefire, albeit one on Russia's terms, he can tell his people that he's actively seeking peace. If he's successful, he not only ends the war while being out to claim victory, but he also prevents millions of Russians from becoming further disillusioned with him and the government he's running. That brings us to another reason why Putin might be looking for a ceasefire. Taking even more territory in Ukraine would likely force Putin to enforce a new wave of military mobilization. Mobilization would create even deeper morale problems inside Russia. According to Radio Free Europe, the September 2022 partial mobilization, which enabled Russia to call up around 300,000 soldiers, triggered tens of thousands of Russians to flee the country. Unfortunately for Putin, that initial mobilization may not be enough to enable Russia to defeat Ukraine. It's gaining territory, as highlighted earlier, but it now faces a Ukraine potentially reinvigorated by new financial and military aid flowing into the country. To take more territory would require more troops to replace those being lost. That's why the Kremlin is now considering plans to announce a new wave of military mobilization. Russia would draw a further 300,000 people out of its population to serve as soldiers on the front lines, ensuring that it has the manpower needed to make further gains if the war continues. However, that proposal comes with a problem. An increasing number of Russians don't want to see a second military mobilization take place. Again, Putin will be well aware of this lack of appetite for mobilization. His September 2022 mobilization led to a definite popularity decrease in Russia, with a Levada Center survey carried out in the immediate aftermath finding that only 53% of Russians believed that Putin's special military operation was going to plan. That was down considerably from the 73% who said the same thing in May of 2022. The Levada Center's survey also found that 47% of Russians were anxious, scared, or horrified by the Kremlin's decision to mobilize, with a further 13% saying they were angry. Only 23% said they felt proud of Russia. That lack of appetite carries through to a potential second round of mobilization. According to the Atlantic Council, an examination of a range of polls conducted in Russia shows that between 50% and 60% of Russians reject the idea of a second wave of mobilization. Perhaps that's why Putin has been slow to follow through on plans for doing it. More mobilization would damage his support in his homeland. It also hints at many in Russia not believing in his cause. Putin likely hoped that his claims that Ukraine is Russian territory, and thus that Russia should fight to reclaim it, haven't been met with the numbers of volunteers his military needs to continue his special military operation. That's why he's been forced to mobilize. A second wave of mobilization might be so damaging to him that declaring a ceasefire would be a far better alternative. That would allow Putin to not only position himself as the victor of the war, but would also let him claim that he's done everything in his power to return Russia's soldiers home. If Zelenskyy refuses to negotiate, he could use that to paint Ukraine's president as the person forcing Russia to send more people into Ukraine. Either way, Putin wins. Still, it's not just the Russian people's opinions that should cause Putin enough concern that he's ready to end the war. It's also the support Ukraine is receiving. In April 2024, the United States approved a $60 billion aid package to Ukraine. That package goes alongside many others from Western nations, adding even more billions in equipment and financial support to Ukraine's coffers. The immediate issue for Russia is that this aid will help Ukraine bolster its defenses and possibly launch counterattacks against Russian positions. The loss of territory that could result would mean any victory Putin declares in a ceasefire would be diminished. Better to declare that victory now than risk losing territory. However, the approval of this and other aid packages also shows that Western nations are growing increasingly wary of Russia and its ambitions. Putin may sense that there's a shift in attitude, with some nations no longer believing that his special military operation will end in Ukraine. It could go further. Several NATO members have already indicated that they will be willing to offer more direct support to Ukraine to defeat Russia. February 2024 saw France's President Emmanuel Macron claim that the possibility of NATO, or at least France, sending soldiers into Ukraine couldn't be ruled out. Macron hasn't backtracked on those statements, even as the rest of his NATO allies claim this isn't a possibility. May 2024 also brought an indirect statement from David Cameron, the UK's Foreign Secretary, that seemed to indicate that Britain would be fine with Ukraine using British-supplied weapons to strike Russia. As Cameron put it, just as Russia is striking inside Ukraine, you can quite understand why Ukraine feels the need to make sure it's defending itself. Moscow called this a very dangerous statement that risked escalating tensions between Russia and NATO. That escalation is the last thing that Putin wants. Though Russia can always make the nuclear threat and has done so on several occasions during the war, Russia's failure to secure Ukraine quickly demonstrates that its military is perhaps not as fearsome as many believed. That military is also depleted, meaning Putin would ideally want to spend time rebuilding before any real conflict with NATO could begin. Hence his openness to a ceasefire. Not only would Putin be able to claim a victory and reinforce his position in Russia with that ceasefire, but no longer fighting in Ukraine could help him to de-escalate tensions with NATO. Those tensions would still exist, of course, and Europe in particular will be wary of Putin's intentions in the immediate aftermath of a ceasefire. But Putin could at least say that NATO has no justification to attack Russia if there's peace in place between Moscow and Kyiv. All of these reasons combined could explain why Putin may be ready to end the war. Unfortunately for Putin, it's likely that a ceasefire isn't going to happen. That's partially due to Zelenskyy and his refusal to even consider the possibility of a supposed peace that would see Ukraine cede large portions of territory to Russia. Speaking to the Wall Street Journal in July 2022, he said, "The territories must be liberated first, and then we can negotiate about what to do and how we can live in the centuries ahead." His stance hasn't changed in the nearly 2 years that have followed. In 2023, he told reporters that he would not be willing to participate in any negotiations mediated by Turkey, noting that he'd asked to start those types of discussions before a full-scale war was declared. Putin wouldn't negotiate then, and Zelenskyy would refuse to negotiate now. As the Ukrainian put it, Putin is not the same man. There is nobody there to talk to. And Zelenskyy again reinforced his position in a discussion with The Economist in January 2024. It's also notable that both Russia and Ukraine have refused to call a ceasefire for the 2024 Olympic Games in July. To Putin, these are the actions of a stubborn man who refuses to come to the table, a picture of Zelenskyy he may paint to the Russian people. But the reality is that Putin's desire for any negotiations to reflect what's happening on the ground is his way of telling Zelenskyy that he would have to cede vast swathes of Ukrainian territory to achieve peace. This wouldn't be a two-way negotiation, and Zelenskyy knows it. For him, it's better to continue fighting, especially with the international support Ukraine has, because that at least presents him with a better chance of keeping Ukraine whole than any ceasefire would. It's also worth noting that Putin's actions don't align with his supposed openness to a ceasefire. In February 2024, Reuters reported that the United States rejected Putin's ceasefire overtures, with the outlet reporting that Putin had contacted Washington through intermediaries in the Middle East to say he was open to talks. The problem was that Putin was unwilling to cede any of the territory Russia had gained up to that point, a position that hasn't changed with these latest suggestions that he's ready to end the war. The US refused, in part, because it didn't want to have to pressure Ukraine into giving up territory to end the war, according to one Russian source. However, another potential reason could be that the US, along with most Western countries, doesn't believe that Putin's ceasefire would result in peace. After all, Putin has denounced the Ukraine Peace Summit scheduled to be held in Switzerland in June 2024. That summit could see several countries come together in a bid to impose conditions on Russia to end the conflict, according to Putin himself. He also claimed that Russia wasn't invited to attend, allowing other countries to cast aspersions on Moscow for not sending a representative when they haven't been allowed to send one. Both are logical points that show Western nations that Putin isn't interested in any kind of ceasefire that doesn't benefit Russia. So Russia and Ukraine are at an impasse. Putin may have expressed a desire to call a ceasefire. That ceasefire would allow him to claim victory and territory and will also let him avoid a second military mobilization in Russia. However, it would come at a great cost to Ukraine, meaning Zelenskyy and his allies are unlikely to agree to the conditions upon which Putin would insist if they ever did come to the table. But what do you think? Are there other reasons why Putin might want to declare a ceasefire now? Is there a possibility that he will be willing to cede any of the territory Russia has captured to end the war in Ukraine? Tell us what you think in the comments, and thank you for watching the video. Now go and check out how the US and UK's aid package to Ukraine will destroy Putin, or click this other video instead.